Possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Excuse me, do you mind if I just sit next to you on this Greyhound bus? I have this idea, I'd like to stab you to death and then cut your head off, and then I thought I'd take pieces of you and eat you. Is that okay? Well, the guy who did that was immediately apprehended and then has spent the last 6 years in one of my favorite loony bins, Selkirk. I think it's been there for about 100 years because that's where I grew up in Manitoba and it was always there. But now, his psychiatrist says that Mr. Lee has made a remarkable recovery and he's now getting unescorted day passes. So many of us are kind of alarmed. Should we be? Maybe we shouldn't be. But the whole process, the whole justice process, but in particular the whole process of what we do with offenders who are really kind of frightening, I think is mysterious to many of us. So we hope to clear some of that up. Our guest today is Dr. Karl M. Williams, who's a forensic psychologist, and this is his stock in trade. His day job really is risk assessment of offenders, and we're delighted that Karl could join us. Hi, Karl.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being here. So I don't want you to be in the position of having to answer for some other psychiatrist. Do you want to say anything about that particular case? Can you make any sense out of it?
I can't say anything about that particular case, but I would just say that the media tend to sort of dwell on what I call the 4 S's, sort of sex, scandal, and scary stuff. And by and large, we've tended to blow the mentally disordered offender out of proportion, and we've become very scared of them. The media tend to dwell on certain cases like this,
yes,
which blow up in our minds, and I think blow up in the public's perception that
yes,
the mentally ill people are going to kill us. We need to fear them very much. And I think certainly there are a small number of cases, the psychotic individuals such as this one, where it is scary, and we do need to be afraid, and we do need to certainly be cautious about the unescorted day passes.
Yeah.
But by and large, I think our perception of the fear out there, the need for anxiety is much more than it should be.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is that we're taking the 0.5% and we're highlighting that, and that's what scares us, when in fact we're doing a reasonably good job generally?
I think we're doing an excellent job generally, and we're doing a better job now than we used to do.
Yes.
And I think it's just that because the media are so good at doing this.
That's what we do.
And of course, and I'm not just blaming the media, but the internet and everything.
Yes.
And we live in the age of anxiety, well said.
Of course.
So our perception of the need to be vigilant is a lot higher, I think, than it needs to be. But in my perception, we're also doing a much better job in terms of risk assessment and in terms of treating the kinds of people who get into trouble too.
You know, one of the most famous American writers of the 20th century, Norman Mailer, went to bat for a criminal named Abbott because the guy was a writer. And no sooner did Mailer and others help get this guy sprung than he killed someone. And then Mailer wrote one of his most famous books, Executioner's Song, about Gary Gilmore. And Gary Gilmore, of course, had the same track record.
Yeah.
So we do have these high-profile cases that scare the living daylights out of us. But your experience is that we're doing fairly well, and you say better.
Yeah, I think we do need to be, as I said earlier, fearful of the people we need to be fearful of.
Yeah.
And we need to identify those individuals carefully and be very careful about at what point we will release them into the community on an escorted or unescorted basis. But by and large, we're doing a better job of treating the average offender.
Do you believe in what I call the break boundary sort of theory? You know, a break boundary comes from physics, that after a certain, it would be sort of like Mach 1 or something. At a certain point, everything changes, you know? it seems to me that in psychology, in terms of criminal behavior, some people kill people, it's sort of an accident or it's a moment of passion or they get carried away or something. And then there's guys who are just flat crazy, or just flat psychopathic, they're Hannibal Lecters, that's their thing, that's who's killing me. I personally have a problem understanding the break boundary people, the people who've gone beyond the pale. Do you personally have a sort of rule of thumb in your head about these people should always just be locked up and kept there forever?
I think a small number of people, a very small number of people, do need to be locked up and kept, if not forever, certainly
a long time.
But there's a whole bunch of people. I read a statistic, I think, just yesterday that there were 140,000 people in the U.S. serving life sentences.
Wow.
Yeah, and if that's correct, and I assume it is correct, that is an astonishing number. So, and the number of people incarcerated generally in the U.S. is astonishing as well.
America is one of the most imprisoning countries in the world.
Exactly.
It's not the most.
It's the most.
Yeah.
And it doesn't do any good because those people can and by and large should get out at some point, in my mind, into the community. So what we need to be doing, David, is identifying who should get out, which is most of them, and how to give them the tools to survive better in society when they do get out.
Yeah. So tell me that. How do we do that? How have you proceeded? You're called to come and visit somebody, and is that how that happens?
Yeah, so I'll receive the call, and I like to sort of conceptualize it as an interaction, hopefully a skillful one, between the heart, the head, and the hand.
Yeah.
The heart, we've talked about the importance for a therapist or an assessor to have an intuition, if you like, a skillful intuition, the gut feeling of what a person's all about. So from the moment I meet someone, I'll try and get a sense of, first of all, their conning level. Are they trying to con me?
Yes.
And also their callous level. So is this person able to consider the needs of other people?
And even a finer tuning is the conning simply their knee-jerk thing they always do, or is it deeply, deeply embedded? Is it kind of pathological, or it's just a bad habit?
Yeah,
right.
And quite often you'll see the life history. It's been a bad habit for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And given the backgrounds of a lot of the individuals I've spoken with, you really can't blame them for being where they're at. But nevertheless,
that's where they're at.
But
my experience says that probably about 1% of those people are kind of permanently embedded pathological con jobs. The rest, it's just a habit, and a lot of people can be talked out of it, can be trained out of it. You can see that the payoffs are not paying off.
That's right. I think, and that hopefully is what we're trying to do by virtue of the treatment programs and by assessing, which is what I do, and then seeing where a person is at in terms of their risk level and so on, and then filtering them into the right kind of remedial treatment.
So so you walk in and you get a kind of gut reaction, and that gut reaction sort of is simmering along because the more information is coming out, and it's all kinds of information. It's not just the words. It's the way this person talks, it's the way they're sitting, the way they respond to you personally. Have you ever felt threatened?
A few times, yeah.
Not often?
Not often,
yeah.
But certainly from time to time.
It's happened?
It's happened. And if it were not to happen, I think I'd be doing something wrong, because my job is to sometimes evoke emotions from people and push buttons sometimes to see how the person will react.
And have you ever had someone come across the table?
I have not, but I do know people who have.
Spooky.
Yeah.
So then do you have a sort of colloquy in your head? Do you have a checklist?
Yeah, that's where
the mind part.
The head comes in.
Yeah.
So then we have a structured or a semi-structured way of. So I'll be talking to you about your background, perhaps, and trying to get a sense of who you are. What your level of insight is, what got you into trouble, if you have the skill set to get yourself out of trouble, or if not, what we refer to in the business as your criminogenic factors. So your density of needs, if you like. So how much help you need to get you away from offending behavior. So that's what I'm trying to do when I'm doing the assessment in terms of seeing how, where you're at in your mind, where you're at in your personality. And at the same time, there's been something of a sea change in the last 20 years or so in terms of how we do assessments.
Yes.
And these days we do actuarial assessments much more. So they're along the lines of an insurance assessment determining risk.
Yes.
And this is simply by virtue of the fact that with computers and with meta-analysis and so on, we're able to look at multiple studies and tease out the factors that are most relevant in terms of
So do you
offending.
actually say, Bob Smith, I give him a 97% on this scale?
That's exactly what we say, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And take sex offenders, for example.
Please.
With sex offenders, some of the best research has been done right here in Canada, by the way.
Yes.
And one of the scales that is used categorizes the individual as being low, moderate, or high risk.
Yes.
And in terms of doing that, we can then get a good idea of first of all, how high they are relative to other sex offenders and how risky they are in terms of going out there and doing it again.
Give me an example of a person who might be a low-risk sex offender. What clues, what kinds of things might you hear that would say to you, okay, this guy isn't way up there?
Well, first of all, I'd say that most sex offenders are relatively low risk relative to what we think.
Really?
Yeah, most people think that once a sex offender, you're always at risk for going out. You're at high risk.
Yes.
And the average sex offender is not at high risk for reoffending. There are some sex offenders who certainly are at high risk, but the lowest risk offender would be the incest offender. So grandpa who offends against his granddaughter, for example.
Yes. Yeah.
They statistically have perhaps a 1% chance of going out in the next 5 years and reoffending, if that. So the lowest risk offenders, the latest research shows between 1 and 3% risk of reoffense in 5 years.
Do you often hear shame and guilt from such people?
We do, from those kind of people in particular who aren't habitual offenders, who haven't done it before.
And not feigned mea culpas, but real shame and guilt.
Real shame and guilt, and that's something that it took a while for me to learn.
Yes.
Was that just because this person has offended and is before me because they've violated the law, and they've offended in a very egregious way, they've done a sexual assault against an innocent victim, that they experience quite the same emotions that we would often experience. So shame and guilt is a big one.
Yeah.
And treating them accordingly and asking the questions with a certain amount of politeness or circumspection, if you like.
Okay, well, I think we'll just take a pause here, catch our breath. When we come back, let's talk about what kinds of recommendations you might make, because we don't get a lot of exposure to, sex offenders are a good example, to what kinds of programs exist for people that actually work, if any, okay? So we'll just take a little breather on that. Give you a chance to notice our email address, davidberner.com is the site to go to. Always happy to hear from you. And also an opportunity for those lovely people who support us to say hello here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. We'll be back with you in just a moment. Yeah, excellent. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. It was 20 years ago today, no, it was just a month ago, that the Sun had this headline, a year's violent crimes tops 12 billion. Yikes. More than a third of the cost stemming from sexual assaults. Now, on the other hand, a few days later, Ottawa backtracks on sex offender program. Circles of Support and Accountability was the program. They protect our kids and make our communities safer, said an NDP MP for Esquimalt. The government had cut off some funding, Dr. Karl, and but now they're restoring it because a lot of people complained. Do these numbers astonish you? Or $12 billion for violent crimes?
Yeah,
so even though we're getting fewer crimes than we did before.
I've read the statistics. I mean, I'm not a criminologist, but the rates for violent crimes, sex assaults, and so on have been dropping since 1991. So I don't know where those numbers are coming from exactly.
So do we have programs in place? Let's stay with sex offenders as a good example. There are programs that you think actually pay off?
Yeah. Treatment works.
Really?
Yeah, it does.
I know treatment works with addiction because I've been involved in it for years, but with sex offenders?
Yes, sex offenders, statistically, if you like, are at lower risk.
That's my cell phone. I forgot to turn it off. Yeah.
At lower risk of reoffending than are untreated sex offenders. So there's a definite effect there. If it were not so, I'm sure that Corrections Canada and their like would not be funding the treatment. So,
what would a program look like?
A program would be, it depends. If it's in the provincial system, it's usually run by Forensic Services, and that's a structured program which basically addresses the needs of the individuals. It's kind of a canned package, but it's tailored somewhat to the individual's needs as well. So it looks like goes through, again, we talked about the criminogenic factors, what got them into trouble, and so it addresses those risk factors and teaches the person how to minimize them.
Is the old saw true that most or so many sex offenders were themselves abused?
Yes, a lot have been. It's more likely you're more likely to become a sex offender if you have been abused.
If a child is sexualized, their sense of boundaries and idea of what sexuality is gets really peculiar when they're older.
Yes. For whatever dynamic is going on there, yes, the short answer is yes, the person is more likely to become a sex offender because of those kinds of issues.
Yeah. And what about violent, let's remove sex from the package, just straight ahead murder and mayhem?
Straight ahead murder and mayhem would go towards the federal system.
Yes.
And they tend to have a similar programs, the violence programs in the federal correctional system. They again address the same kind of needs, perhaps dwelling more on impulse control, anger control issues by virtue of the nature of the offense, but the same kinds of things, what got you into trouble, what you need to do to get yourself out of trouble, and to minimize or reduce your risk of reoffending.
Is it all cognitive behavior stuff, or other things?
It tends to fall into that, and again, I'm not a treatment specialist, so it's a little bit removed from my specialty, but it tends to be along those lines. Psychoeducational, I guess, would be a better name for it.
So once you've interviewed somebody, you interview this guy named Bob, and you do this kind of what did you call it? Like forensic accounting almost.
Yes.
Then you make a recommendation. Is that part of your job?
Yeah, that's part of the job, and it depends who I'm doing the assessment for. But quite often it will be this person requires high intensity supervision, requires treatment, requires whatever they require. Normally it's some sort of mixture of those.
And does anybody listen?
I like to think so.
Well, I don't know. You could be making recommendations in the dark, you see.
Sometimes I feel I am doing that, but for the most part, I don't think so. If it's the court, they certainly traditionally do tend to listen, I think, to recommendations. And if you're doing it for an agency such as Corrections Canada, they also tend to listen. National Parole Board, tends to, who I do assessments and have done a lot of assessments for, they tend to listen, I think, most of the time, but then they make their own minds out.
Well, I think you and the rest of the community can sleep better at night knowing that the Parole Board considered me to be a member and rejected me.
So,
so
well, that speaks to their
wisdom.
Their wisdom.
Yeah,
yes.
I would have said no to everybody. You see, I wouldn't have let anybody out.
Well, it's a fine, delicate balance there, David.
Prison boss defends absences for killers. This headline, which also is fairly recent in the last month, actually in the last few days, goes to the issue of who gets to call the shots. I think a lot of people are kind of astonished, people in the public are astonished, lay people, that you know, courts and judges lay down a sentence, and then the corrections department seems often to blithely ignore that and just do whatever they want, you know.
Well, they're under their own pressures, and I wouldn't attempt to defend the correction system, but they're under pressures to get people out into the community in good shape.
Yes.
Like you were saying earlier, a small percentage should be retained inside,
Absolutely.
but the rest are going to get out at some point. So I think the mandate, the perception on their part is to get them out in a graduated way and try and do it in a way that will make them, you know, at lower risk for having problems when they get back into the community.
Karl, my sense of this, after, you know, I spent years going in and out of prisons and looking at these kinds of things, is that probably 1% of all the people incarcerated, especially in federal prisons, should be there for a long, long time, if not forever. Some, you know, maybe 0.5% should never get out of there because they're just flat crazy and dangerous. But most of those inmates, I describe them as just goofs, and they've just made lousy decisions. Do you have some sense or hope that corrections can work with these guys and start them on a path, start them on paths that, you know?
I would like to say yes.
Yeah,
in the few decades I've been doing this job, I haven't seen a whole lot of reason for optimism in that regard. But as I said earlier, treatment does tend to work.
Yes.
And so if we give these people the skill set with which to handle their lives better, then they're in better shape. But we're dealing again with people who have a life history. So if someone comes into the system at 20, a life history of being that way, changing them radically in 18 months, 2 years, 3 years is a tough road to hoe.
Yeah, it's a tough assignment. But I recall vividly years ago being in a group, staging a group in Drumheller, and asking this young guy, "Can you drink?" at some point. And he didn't know what I meant. And I had to ask it 5 times, and then the group started ganging up on him and saying, "You're not getting it, you're not getting the question." In other words, every time this poor kid drank, he ended up in a bar fight and ended up charged with assault and doing time.
Right.
But nobody had ever asked him to think, can you drink? Are you not getting this connection, buddy, that you and drinking end up with this?
Yeah, and that's why it's very important the people who are tasked with doing the therapy with these people have both the knowledge and also the wisdom, if you like, to ask those kinds of questions and push those kinds of buttons. Otherwise, you won't make radical change.
Dare you say, we just have about 4 minutes left, if you were king for a day, if you were the god of all these things, what handful of things might you change or inaugurate to get a more productive system?
I would carry on doing what we're doing to some extent. I would make sure that the treatment we're giving is based not just upon cost efficiency, but upon bringing in the kinds of people and the kinds of treatment that we definitely need and works better. And I think some of that is being done. Okay. So I think the research is certainly.
But I'm hearing you say you would afford more.
Well, I think we need to. I guess if I were king for a day, I would change the world. But unfortunately, I changed society, and I have views again about society and the way we're treating people and the way that the problems out there. That we need to start addressing those as well, not just when the person gets into custody. So.
Yeah, long before someone gets
into
custody.
So that's part of my kingdom, if you will. I would extend that beyond and before.
We have to do an awful lot of work with youngsters.
Exactly.
So that youngsters are not going into these directions.
Yes.
Are you, when you do a report, do you send it by mail or email, or are you actually called to stand up in court?
Both. I wouldn't send it by email, given the confidentiality or lack thereof. Our college is very strict about such issues. So yes, I would get called to court sometimes. Quite more often than not, I'm not. But I have been called many times to testify.
You okay with that?
Yeah.
Not your all-time favorite activity?
No, some people say they really like it, and I always worry about their mental health. But I admire them for it, I guess. It's a challenge.
But you do it when called upon. Now, do you do assessments for people other than people like Corrections Canada? I mean, What kinds of people?
Lawyers. I've done some directly for the court, BC corrections.
Why would a lawyer ask you to do?
Usually it's because they want to get their client the least onerous sentence, so that they would try and find out more about their clients and then take that to court and use that for whatever purpose.
That's a tricky assignment because the guy who's paying you is looking for a particular kind of result.
He is, or she is, but most of us are trained very much to be objective, and we're required to by the courts. So no matter, we're being paid for our time, not our opinions, so we're very careful about...
Are there some blinds put on in some way?
Yeah, very much so. But that's something we always have to be careful of, to make sure that the funding source isn't somehow given an opinion that's or isn't swayed by that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Karl Williams. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, folks, we're going to say goodbye. And oddly enough, we rarely do this thematic kind of thing, but it just happens that next week, Catherine Adamson and Margaret Burrell will join us, and they are from the Wrongful Death Law Reform Group. And that will kind of follow what we've been talking about. It's a kind of a gruesome subject, but it's a very, very important one. So I hope you join us for that. In the meantime, we thank you for being with us here today on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Good night. Yeah, good stuff.